Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the workshop and the afternoon tea. We're moving into the last session of today, and this is certainly a session that I've been really looking forward to. It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome our final guest for the seminar today. And I can think of no one more fitting really to speak to us on a day that we're celebrating women and talking politics and strong women and standing and delivering. Michelle Grattan is one of Australia's most respected and awarded political journalists. She's been a member of the Canberra Parliamentary Press Gallery for more than 40 years, during which time she covered the most significant stories in Australian politics. A former editor of the Canberra Times, Michelle was also the first female editor of an Australian daily newspaper. She was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2004 for her long and distinguished service to Australian journalism. And she joined the University of Canberra this year as a professorial fellow, something we're all absolutely delighted about. So will you join me in welcoming Michelle Grattan? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that welcome. What I wanted to do today was not give a formal presentation, but encourage a conversation, a dialogue, and questions covering your areas of interest. So I will invite people to start the ball rolling, and we'll get through as much as we can in the time. Who'd like to begin?
I'm Ingrid Mackenzie and I'm a student midwife. It's clear from the evidence that home birth is a safe option for many women, but midwives who choose to support women to do that, and women themselves who choose to do it, are often portrayed as dangerous, irrational, that kind of thing. I'm wondering what you think we can do to improve public image of home birth and how it's portrayed in the media.
Well, obviously I'm not commenting on the question itself because I have absolutely no qualification to do that, but accepting what you're saying and just looking at how you put out your message, obviously I think through your professional channels, professional journals, specialist areas, which gives a certain basis of expertise to what you're saying. And then more broadly, I think through women's publications that are directed towards women. There are, of course, a number of these sort of channels now. There's the traditional women's magazines and so on, but there's a growing online specialist set of publications, online publications. For example, Fairfax, I know, has one which goes, I think particularly is directed to women in the regions, but across the media now, the new media, there are those sorts of outlets, and they offer potential that people mightn't be quite as aware of as they are of the more traditional publications. And then, of course, there are areas like regional radio generally. I think radio is always a very effective mechanism for getting messages out. It's simple, it's relatively extended in terms of interviews. The voices go out direct, they're not filtered by a journalist. I'm sounding now like a politician rather than a journalist, but that is an important point. And again, if you can put out specialist, expert, credible voices through that sort of medium, then you do get the message across, I think, as best you can.
How about me? Michelle, sometimes we're kind of led to believe that if it's written in a newspaper, if we hear it on the radio or on the television, that it's a fact. And I wonder if you'd like to comment on whether you agree with this, or whether do you think actually that the media has an important role in constructing the events in our public life, or the phenomena that we read and listen to.
Okay, there are two questions really bound up in this, two separate questions. One is how accurate and reliable the media are these days, and I think, to be frank, they are not as accurate and reliable as they should be. I think that there's a lot of pressure these days to get things out very quickly, things online immediately, and at the same time there's a great deal of fewer staff having to do more because of cost cutting and the pressures that especially the mainstream media are under. So I do think that this has diminished accuracy, and it's probably diminished the priority that's given to accuracy. Unfortunately, there is a sort of thought in online publication that, well, you can change it if it's wrong. Having moved from print to online, that can be convenient, let me tell you. If you do make a mistake and have a panic attack at 3 a.m, you can not do anything about it if it's in the hard copy of a paper, but you can leap out if you have the technical skill to change it online or get someone else to do so. So there is that accuracy issue. But you're also talking about whether the media are players or just reporters. Well, clearly they are both players and reporters. Anyone who says that they're not players, we're talking about political media here, is not really facing up to a fairly obvious fact. Even those people who, and I'm one of those who would prefer to have the media as reporters rather than players, would accept that inevitably what people write influences the situation. It may do so simply because they've got a story, they've obtained a story, and that has its own effect, or they may be used by particular sources or allow themselves to be used or like to be players, and therefore they're injected into the political cycle. And of course people have different and strong views on this, and I guess from the politician's point of view it often depends on whether those players are working or their work is to the politician's advantage or to his or her disadvantage. But certainly the media does have a playing role. Let's take a couple of examples in the whole Gillard-Rudd battle over years. Clearly, the Rudd forces were using the media as an instrument of destabilisation. I don't think that there's any doubt about that, and the Gillard forces used it to try and fight back. More recently and currently, we've got the whole spy revelations, which has caused a crisis in relations between Australia and Indonesia. Those came out through the media. Now, I'm not saying the ABC, which was one of the channels that they came out through, I'm not saying that they meant to be or mean to be players in that situation. But of course, the fact that those revelations have been published has changed a situation, has caused a situation, and to that extent the media is a player just as other people are.
Can I just ask on that point, one of the issues we face as midwives is an increasing sense of fear from women about childbirth and risk, and most people attribute this partly to the way childbirth is portrayed in the media, because headlines are quite exciting when it's a near miss, it's a miracle baby, it's a rescue, whereas a normal woman has normal baby, is never going to make a headline. So I wondered, in terms of getting those sort of more positive stories out there, what's attractive to the media? How would you get a story into something like Women's Day that had quite a normal focus, that wasn't about a miracle baby or something exciting like that?
Well, I think the story has to have some angle because, as you say, no news is not normally news, and that is, I know that's a frustrating thing. I know it's a problem, but you do need to have an angle. You know, someone with 10 children or whatever. But in terms of your more fundamental point about the bad news being played up, I think this is a real difficulty, and it goes across a number of areas, and it's probably got worse in recent years. I think with the faster news cycle, with everything's got to be go, 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 and also news outlets are competing for audience. The audience that a number of them have had has comparatively shrunk or become more difficult to get at or whatever. And so stories are sensationalised, there's no doubt about this. In fact, I've just come from writing a column where I was doing something on the Productivity Commission report, which has said we should discuss lifting the pension age to 70, which has a lot of arguments for it, I think. But the headline in the Daily Telegraph today was "Work till you drop." Or I think I'm rendering it properly, but near enough. So it's the same thing at a policy level that you're talking about at a personal level. And there's no doubt that, you know, the odd problem, the odd accident or whatever there's a tendency to not just say, well, that was terrible, that happened, but to say that was terrible and it shows the system is terrible or the procedure or whatever it is. I think people are less accepting these days, and this includes the audiences for this material, less accepting of the fact that bad things sometimes happen, and it doesn't mean that the whole system or giving birth or whatever is in some sort of catastrophic state. And people probably do focus on the negative more, to an extent more than they used to. They're a bit less sort of robust, I think.
Michelle, in this audience today, we have a number of women that are about to embark on a new career in 2014 and 2015. Coming from a long, useful career yourself in a public career, what advice would you give to these women?
Well, I think it depends on, you're talking about people embarking on a career in midwifery?
Yes.
Yep. Because it obviously depends on the sort of career you're embarking on. I think one thing perhaps to remember in these times is, because you start on this career, you may not end your working life in that career. I think these days there's much more movement, and in the future there'll be much more movement between jobs, between particular jobs in one area and between even careers, so that you might get to 45 and find, for one reason or another, you need to change careers. So I think you go into it with a flexible attitude, with an open mind about where you'll be at the end of it. I think that also you need to go into it obviously with a lot of commitment, and I'm sure you have that already, so that's something that almost doesn't need to be said. But these sorts of jobs where you're under a great deal of pressure, where those you are looking after, and this goes to the question before, probably more demanding than in the past. It does take a lot of dedication, a lot of patience, a willingness to sort of put up with things that perhaps your predecessors didn't put up with. It's a bit like university life these days, that students have become consumers. So they've been a lot more demanding of their lecturers. They're more likely to mark their lecturers, as it were, just as their lecturers are marking their performance, which was quite different. I think when I went through university, you never thought of yourself as buying a service, you know, and you'd have some good lecturers and bad lecturers and crazy eccentric lecturers, and you just sort of took that as part of life. You didn't sort of protest that you weren't getting value for money. But I think in all the professions, those buying the services, as it were, are more demanding, and sometimes perhaps excessively demanding, but you've got to live with that and adapt to it. And probably in your profession, the customer is not necessarily always right, but perhaps you have to work harder to persuade her that she is not right on occasions.
There's changing economic times at the moment, as there probably always is, but we have a health system that really needs midwives more than ever. What is the best way to boost that budget and to get the public aware that they really need midwives?
Well, budgets are tight now, and they're going to get tighter. I suppose, I don't know this, but perhaps you have some cost advantage through your services compared to alternative services, and that always puts you in a good position. I think, again, you need to rely on your professional associations to argue the case and to guide you into where you best put your case, and you need to cultivate political and professional friends wherever you can get them.
Hello, Michelle. Nice to see you. I've heard you interviewed on the ABC many times, so it's nice to see you in the flesh. What responsibility do you see the press has in terms of educating citizens about the evidence for particular forms of healthcare?
Well, I think that the press does have a responsibility. It has a responsibility to report what's happening. It has a responsibility to provide proper voices, a range of voices, but in healthcare, it's a trickier question than in some other areas, such as politics, for example, because there is also the question of the publicity that's given to people who are on the fringes, you know, dissenting voices. And I didn't actually see it, but there was the program recently about the drugs. You'd be familiar with this, I'm sure, some of you. Yes, and the dangers that it presented, you know, putting a case that might lead people to behaviour that, or stopping taking drugs that most medical professionals thought were necessary and desirable. That's just an example of, and there's a whole vaccination argument, obviously. So it does involve, I think, for those writing or broadcasting in this area, it can involve some fairly difficult choices about what weight or what access to publicity you give to some of the fringe voices. so that's an interesting issue in itself. But in general, I think that the media does have a responsibility to cover health fully and in a balanced way and in a way that's informative for the public. I sometimes wonder, you see all these articles that come out of various journals and so on, and they get a burst of publicity, and you do sometimes wonder about whether, you know, they're really quite what they seem to be on the surface, whether they sometimes get too much publicity as a study that might be legitimate enough, but really is only a very small scale thing from which you can't generalise, or you can't really say much more than this was a limited study of a regional area which showed such and such, you know. So it's important not to exaggerate or distort, I think, in medical coverage.
Hi Michelle, this session is entitled Strong Women, Politics and the Media. What have you learnt about strength that you wish you knew when you were a cadet journalist?
Sorry, I missed the last bit. Learnt about strength?
Yes, that you wish you knew when you were a cadet journalist.
Oh, that's a very hard question. I suppose I've learnt a fair bit about sort of competence that I wish I knew when I was a cadet journalist. I don't know whether I've actually learnt a great deal about strength. I bought a book and have partly read it about focus recently, and I think that that is quite an important thing for a journalist, because it's a very inefficient trade, journalism. You know, you spend a lot of time, figuratively speaking, sitting about on the floor waiting for things to happen or waiting for people or whatever. Sometimes in my earlier days I literally spent a fair bit of time sitting on the floor waiting for people. But it is a trade where you do need to waste a fair bit of time and energy to get what you want and need for stories. And so I suppose being focused on what you do need and persistence and so on. Not quite sure that that's strength. The one thing that you do learn is that you need to tell the story, tell the truth as you see it, and that in terms of political reporting will mean that sometimes you've got to be quite critical of people that you might like or have had long dealings with or so on, and that requires a certain strength, and it also reminds you that you mustn't ever get too close to these people, because one of these days you have to criticise them. So I suppose the strength lesson is to be as objective as you can. I don't think total objectivity is possible, but it's a desirable goal, and to be tough when you have to. On the other hand, don't be just tough for the sake of it. And, you know, you sometimes sort of, there's a give and take in this, you give a bit of ground to make sure you're being fair to people.
You sort of incidentally answered the question that I was going to pose to you, which was something along the lines that a journalist is in an invidious position because you're both an employee, and so, but you also need to have this symbiotic relationship with political actors. You need stuff from them so that you can write it. So you have to sort of not ingratiate yourself, but at least endear yourself to people who'll tell you things so that you can report it. And it seems to me you have to be both a confidant, but you have to be an employee and bear in mind that this is an economic enterprise, and so that there is a policy of the paper. But on the other hand, you see, if you do what you say you do and you want to do as
an autonomous professional, which is to tell the truth as you see it, you're faced with these competing demands and push and pull forces. And what you said is at the end of the day that ideally what you do is try to be objective as possible. I think you actually do that, because when I listen to you on Radio National, this is the new question now, when I listen to you talk to Fran Kelly in the mornings, which I do when I'm having a cup of tea in bed, you're pretty even-handed. But you see, if I was a politician, I wouldn't tell you anything, or a celebrity journalist, with all respect, because unless it was a kind of judicious leak. And so I'm wondering how much democracy is now about judicious leaking of stuff to strategically placed celebrity journalists like yourself, and therefore where we are left as a democracy because of it.
Okay, well, you've packed a lot in there, and you've actually identified a lot of strands that are very legitimate problems. I'll try and work my way through them, and I might have to get some prompting if I forget. Let me just take the last point first. I'm not a celebrity journalist. There are celebrity journalists around. I mean, I'm obviously a fairly well-known journalist, and I've been a long time at it. But celebrity journalists are a quite different phenomenon. So, okay, yes, my name is known, but not celebrity. Now, just to go back to the point you identified at the start, the employer point first. I guess and now I work for The Conversation, and I certainly don't have any political interference from people there. Sometimes you might have ideas thrown at you. Wouldn't it be a good idea to do a piece on Tony Abbott being there 100 days, for example? But people are not, and obviously people have views, but I mean, you're not in a position where you have to say, oh yes, someone suggests some story and I leap to write that line. And I have been lucky because I have worked all my career, except for the time at the Canberra Times when it wasn't a Fairfax paper, but I was editor and so obviously in a different position, but all my career for Fairfax, and there was not political pressure or pressure for a line. There certainly is pressure for a line, though, in certain newspapers. I'm just telling you about my experience, and there's no doubt that there's that sort of pressure. So yes, those journalists are in an awkward position. And sometimes, of course, that is particularly hard for junior journalists because they want to get on, because they're in less of a position than the senior ones to resist that pressure. So that is difficult, and you've identified an important strand there. Now, in terms of the politicians, again, you are quite right that if you are seen, well, one thing is if you're working for a paper that either has a strong line or carries great audience numbers or clout or whatever, that gives power. So, for example, people on the Daily Telegraph, which is in the position of all those positions, would attract stories in a routine sort of way, but also people who are known to be sympathetic to a line, identified with a line, or will write what they're given with a certain slant from the giver. Yes, they attract more stories than people who position themselves as I do. That is a fact of life. So you can either go down that path or you can go down the other path, and I'm not saying here which is right or wrong, but the path I have chosen is the path to call it as you see it. Yes, you do sacrifice some advantages by doing that, but you also gain other advantages.
The media has been seen or labelled as the fourth estate. You know, it's the watchdog of the people, in a way. It's this quintessential arm of democracy. It's even been called the fifth estate now that we have social media. But because of the 24/7 news cycle and this heightened commercialism, because everything's moved online and newspapers are under threat, and you've talked yourself in here, in Monitor, about that there's been huge mass sackings of journalists across all of the sectors, and fewer people are being asked to do more, and their views are networked across a range of publications. So it was this thing about democracy which I think concerns us all. Where does it leave the media now? Is it about strategic leakage only?
No, it's not. And the strategic leaks have, of course, always been a feature of political coverage. It's not just now. And to some extent, the market not necessarily sorts it out, but I mean the market of leaks and counter leaks and so on does have a certain balancing effect. But I think that there are really vast problems with the fewer voices, and especially the fewer voices in the more senior ranks and in the what used to be broadsheet media. Tabloid now in Fairfax Monday to Friday, but this is a problem. And I'm not talking here about opinions, because in a way there are more opinions, but opinion is cheap, as they say. It's really people who know about an issue, who, if you're dealing with the health issue, for example, who can say, well, yes, so-and-so is saying this about health policy, but there was a report 3 years ago that said something else, who can evaluate those things. Now, you have got fewer specialist health writers, I think, than you had a few years ago, and that really is reflected in a whole lot of areas. I've just been thinking about this reform question, and if you contrast it with the 80s, you had some very strong, knowledgeable economic writers who would know as much in terms of, not necessarily what was going on, but as much in terms of basic economic facts and so on as a person in the Treasury. You just have fewer of these people now, and this is a real problem. And when it's combined with the sort of go media, the speed of the news cycle, it's bad. I think people are badly served by it. There's no doubt, but I don't quite know what can be done about it. But I do know that while it's a good thing to have the proliferation of online media, the sort of organisations I work for, or one of which I work for, it is not an adequate counter to the shrinking diversity of the mainstream media, because the mainstream media is still what's in the head of the political decision makers. They're actually, well, we would say now they're actually quite old-fashioned, but be that as it may, the mainstream media does still carry the clout.
Thank you. I wanted to throw in a question around feminism, and obviously,
About
feminism.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And obviously, we've had in the last period politically, we've had a female prime minister. We now have a federal parliament that has minimal front bench women. I would like to ask what you think about the position of women as it stands in our society today, as opposed to perhaps the push forward in the 80s of the feminist movement.
Well, it's a very broad question, but at the political level, of course, there was a lot of argument about to what extent gender was unfairly used against Julia Gillard, to what extent her problems were caused by a gender attack or whether it was her own competence. I think that's a quite difficult thing to unravel, frankly, but I think that if political circumstances had been different, and probably her own decisions had been different, she would have been in a much better position. I don't think that the gender attacks were the primary thing, but when she was weakened, they sort of came in and reinforced the problem. Women generally in Parliament, yes, certainly it's a bit of a low point on the coalition side. I think that Tony Abbott was not accurate in where he said that, there were women knocking on the cabinet door or the ministry, certainly the cabinet door and the ministry door, because at the next level down there are very few women there, and it is a problem for them. It's a problem for the Liberal Party. They need to somehow address bringing through more women, but when politics has been particularly feral, a lot of women and quite a few men too are not that attracted to it. So it is not a great time for women in federal politics at the moment. On the other side, Tanya Plibersek has, of course, done well, deputy leader, and has a lot of opportunity, but Labor too has found it a bit of a struggle. It set targets, it had high hopes, but has fallen short to a reasonable degree.
That's all the time we have for questions. I wish we had longer because I can see we could, I'm sure you don't wish we had longer, but I do. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. We're really appreciative. It's very, very useful for us. And I hope you'll just accept this small token of our appreciation. So join me in thanking Michelle Grattan.
Thank you.